Saying a little bit before about um, journalists not being in touch with the citizens, with people around them. Um, there is a lot of times there gets to be pretty fierce debates about maybe a column on the Tennessean's website or something. Um, or maybe there's story suggestions that there are a lot of posts and content. Do you think that journalists or people at the Tennessean or other websites simply don't credit those leads or stories, or do you think that there's just not enough value in not having a face to face or hey, I really want this story covered, or calling in?
In other words, you're saying you think people are still calling the newspaper, but the reporters are just not following up.
Right. Well, I was kind of saying that, like, do you think that I think that people still are since people are on the internet so much, I think people are still posting on the internet on these websites. But is that not effective? It obviously seems like it's not effective in getting people's attention unless you just give them a call and say, hey,
I don't know, but I do know, but just on a practical level, if you pick up the phone and try to call a daily newspaper, let's not pick on Nashville, call the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in search of a reporter who covers this or that person, and you won't get them. They're protected by the system, and so the reporters, for better or for worse, try to avoid interacting with a lot of people. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that many reporters with that many people skills, or the idea of cultivating sources. And I may be wrong on that, but as far as, I mean, like, there'll be a story. They've done this thing where they allow people to comment, and half the time it's obscene, or it's absurd. It may be that allowing the fringe elements in our society to write in has made it more difficult for a reporter to be able to differentiate an intelligent person from one who's mentally ill. I think that may have something to do with it.
Right. You just said then about cultivating sources, and I think that's kind of a term that a lot of people aren't even very familiar with as far as what that really means. Could you kind of elaborate on what you would define as cultivating a source?
Well, I just remember there's a couple of people. I remember when I covered real estate in Nashville. I'd never been to Nashville hardly before in my life, and I didn't know much about real estate, and I just assumed that I did, and so I just got to know some people they seemed to be in the middle of the real estate thing, and I probably talked to them once a week. I'd call them for no reason, just to ask how they were and ask them if anything was going on. Eventually they got to the point where they trusted me, and eventually they got to the point where they would tell me things that gave me the story before anyone else. One of them died about 2 months ago. His name was John Harcastle, and he was head of the H.G. Hill Realty Company, which owns a lot of land in Nashville. Like, they own half of Hillsborough Village, for instance. And he told me about the building, that we're going to tear down these buildings and we're going to build this new pancake pantry. I remember him telling me that, and then he told me that the pet store is going to close, and I think some kind of coffee thing is going in there. And I mean, he would tell me these things, and my rule was that John will never get in trouble, and so but I always beat everybody on all those stories, and John trusted me, and but I don't know if there's ever many reporters who really cultivate sources like that.
Thinking back again to all your experience, what are some of the most, like, I guess sometimes that you've gotten bitten on doing something, but what are some of the most valuable lessons that you've learned through your experience?
Well, one is that people have to trust you. That may be one thing I've taken out of journalism. I run a nonprofit now, and that we have friends in all areas, and people trust me still. Some of the people I covered as a reporter trusted me then; they still trust me now. And trying to think of lessons. Let me think. I guess the value of relationships. I think eventually people realized that I wasn't somebody who was going to be here 3 years and then move on. And one of the things about newspaper, even the really good reporters, are on a come here, stay for a couple years, and move on. Come here, stay, and so you're not going to get that kind of trust. I will mention one thing. I remember now looking back at it that people didn't trust me as much before the book came out. The Fortune Spittles book changed everything in terms of the way people felt about me, at the business leaders. Suddenly, from that point onward, I was almost too trusted. It would have almost been very difficult to go back to doing regular journalism because I knew everything. People had opened up to me and told me everything. And the most vivid example of this, I remember this now. When I did the book, I interviewed Monroe Carroll, who was head of Central Parking. He's now dead. But at some point along the way, he brought me to his office when he was trying to sell his company. There's a table over there. This is an interesting dilemma. And then he said, I have to get up, I'll be right back. And he went to the bathroom or something. And I looked over, and he had all these, I kind of went up and looked at it, and it was all the presentations from the companies that were trying to take over Central Parking. And it was down to like 4 of them. And he came back and he said, you know what those are? And he told me, well, those were all very, very secret things. And so got to the point where people tell me too much.
Yeah.
So,
too much to know.
Too much to know.
Too much for one man to know.
Yeah, because what happens is, here's the problem. Let's say he tells me that, and then I find out through someone else. Then I can't run it because he thought I would have gotten it from him. And so that almost got too dangerous, though.
Now I know you've gone from journalism to pursue other things, but what would you say that you enjoyed most about covering and reporting news?
One is that people regarded you somewhat highly. You had access to, the mayor would take your call. Everybody acted like they knew you, and to a certain degree, that's you realize when you get out of journalism, oh, it turns out the mayor's not my friend after all. I thought he always took my call, and but it was very interesting. It was something different every day, and you could generally, in my case, they let me do my own thing as long as at the end of the day I had a story, or at the end of the week I had a story. I never went 3 or 4 days without a story. I was never the person working on something for a month. So it was a challenge a day, and it was certainly the kind of thing that if you go to a party after work, you've got something interesting to tell people.
Right. Excellent. Okay, well, kind of just wanted to ask you about keeping in mind people that are aspiring to be journalists or aspiring to work in television or newspaper. And you've kind of given already a lot of good tips, but maybe what are some additional tips that you would maybe give them, especially in context of where you think journalism is headed?
Well, one thing that might have helped me is I was very interested in Nashville's history, and that probably helped me become a better reporter because I worked with a guy named David Fox, and he grew up here, and he knew everything there was to know about Nashville, and I didn't know anything about Nashville. And so I started researching it just so I wouldn't feel constantly inferior to him. And eventually, one day, I felt like it was pretty tough because I knew more about it than he did. And but I wanted to be somebody who just knew everything. I thought knowledge was power. I wouldn't necessarily worry if you have a job in journalism. I wouldn't worry too much about how the person before you did it. I hate to be arrogant, but if you go into a newspaper setting, then 3 or 4 months later you say to yourself, "Gosh, I'm not nearly as good as the person who had this job before I was," then you're probably in the wrong profession. You want to at least feel like you're doing a better job than the person before you, and do it differently. I remember taking a job, my first job at the Tennessean, and the person before me had kept all these files, and they kept everything, and I don't keep anything. I keep it all up here, and so to the degree that I keep anything, and finally one day I just dumped the whole file cabinet. I didn't want all these old Macy's annual reports. What do I want those for? Besides, if I want them, I can get them. And she came back and said, "Where's my files?" And I said, "I don't have them. I threw them all out." She was furious at me, but my job wasn't to keep a file cabinet. It was to come up with something interesting every day. And probably the other thing is, if you do go into a journalism setting where you're a hard-hitting person, it's very difficult to not offend people, and I'm not worried about the general community, other people in the newsroom can easily get offended, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about that. But imagine how furious people get if they go away for a week, and during the week you're doing their job, you break the biggest story of the year. And that kind of thing happened to me once or twice. And then next thing you know, everybody on that side of the room says, keep him away from you. But, you know.
All right. Well, I think that's about all that I have to
Man.
ask you, and I appreciate a lot your help, and thank you very much.
Thanks, man. So tell me where you're from over here again.
I am from just right about right there.
O'Brien?
Yep, O'Brien County. I live right outside Troy.